Welcome to the Emerging Civil War Podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me all the way from the outskirts of Illinois is my good friend Dave Powell. Dave, how you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. And Dave is taking a break from writing one of his 3,000 books to talk with us today. You've got another book out. It's been quite a year for you, Dave.
It has. It actually has been in the past 2 years, I've had 4 books come out. And this one just came out about the middle of November.
So today we're talking about The Impulse of Victory. It's about Ulysses S. Grant at Chattanooga, part of the World of Ulysses S. Grant series from Southern Illinois University Press. And Dave, let me ask you a question that many of our readers think of you as a Chickamauga guy. So get us to Chattanooga, please.
Well, Chattanooga flows directly out of Chickamauga, of course. The whole purpose of the Chickamauga campaign is to capture the water level passage and rail hub that is the city of Chattanooga. It's the gateway to the Deep South. It's the only water level passage through the Appalachian Mountains between, say, Virginia and down into Alabama. So it becomes crucial. If you're going to go to Atlanta, go through Georgia, go even down into Alabama. And then Rosecrans is defeated at the Battle of Chickamauga and retreats into the city of Chattanooga. He's captured the city even before the battle because the Confederates had to abandon it for fear that they would get trapped as well. But suddenly, say September 23rd, 24th, it's General Rosecrans who's trapped in Chattanooga. The Confederates are on Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain. They don't have a good way to get across the Tennessee River. And that means that they can't move back into Middle Tennessee or really threaten Rosecrans' larger logistical trail or train. They're not going to take Bridgeport, and they're not going to take Murfreesboro, Tennessee, or Nashville. They're not going to get that far. They just don't have the resources. But winter is coming. September and the summer really of 1863 had been pretty dry. At the end of September starts to see rain. October and November are tons of rain. It turned the landscape into a quagmire of mud. And it doesn't take too long into October before the Federals start to realize that with no rail access, with Confederates cutting off the best roads, their only way to haul supplies into Chattanooga, haul troops out of Chattanooga, wounded, whatever, sick, is over a mountain ridge called Walden's Ridge, and the roads are deteriorating. And so it doesn't take too much of a military genius to figure out if things are bad in October and November, what are they going to be like in December, January, February, when the roads really become impassable? And in the meantime, in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Chickamauga, of Rosecrans' defeat and the retreat, it falls like such a shock on the federal government in Washington and really the whole nation. We've had success at Vicksburg. We've had the nation's entire fascination with Gettysburg, whether you call it a victory, a decisive victory, however you want to term it. That's what, historians will debate that endlessly. But in 1863, Meade's defeat at Gettysburg was a big deal. And then came Vicksburg, and that was a really big deal. The newspapers are full of victory and triumph. And then starting in September 22, 23, 24, there's disaster in Tennessee. And the government reacts quickly, and they start to converge troops from all theaters, from Mississippi, from Virginia. They're sending troops to rescue General Rosecrans. And one of the men that is tasked with this job, really the man who's tasked with this job, is Ulysses S. Grant.
You've covered a lot of ground there, and I want to take a second just to back up because you did mention about how Rosecrans captures Chattanooga before the Chickamauga campaign even gets going. That's the subject of another one of your recent books that you co-authored with Eric Wittenberg about the Tullahoma campaign. Let's just touch on that real quickly so we have the chance, so folks at home have the chance to remember to go get this really good book.
Yes, it's been that kind of year. Tullahoma came out right at the end of the summer. And Eric and I had, for various reasons, been interested in Tullahoma. Eric's, of course, one of our premier Civil War cavalry historians. And I've been reading cavalry work from Eric since the 1990s. And we realized, I had realized for a long time, certainly many other Civil War historians had mentioned to me, no one has really talked about Tullahoma. It's that campaign that everyone says really needs a book, but no one has ever written a book on. And for various reasons, Eric had some writing on cavalry actions at places like Shelbyville and Hoover's Gap, both small actions in the middle of the Tullahoma campaign. And I wanted to write a larger campaign history, so we joined forces. And this was 2019. We finished writing in 2019, and it came out.
It's ironic that. Now, I think it's ironic that just a few minutes ago you mentioned about Gettysburg being a big deal and Vicksburg being a really, really big deal. Tullahoma was a big deal too, and even you, as author of the book, kind of left it out of that triumvirate of victory.
You're correct.
Newspapers.
But I was talking about how it was a big deal in terms of impact in the Northern popular opinion.
Indeed. And
Tullahoma.
Rosecrans was worried that it would be forgotten.
He was actually very frustrated. His famous quote in a telegram to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton is, "Don't overlook this campaign because it's not written in letters of blood." The Union casualties at Tullahoma were only about 560 killed, wounded, and missing. Braxton Bragg lost in the campaign a few more. He probably lost no more than 700 or 800 killed or wounded, but he lost several thousand to desertion and capture. So militarily, Tullahoma is very important. Clears Middle Tennessee and sets the stage for the direct advance on Chattanooga. Politically, and in the sort of milieu of mid-1863, it does get overlooked. The newspapers aren't banner headlines about Tullahoma. They're banner headlining Gettysburg and Vicksburg, especially the Western newspapers with Vicksburg.
And then I'll just mention that ties into the very subtitle of your book, Tullahoma, the Forgotten Campaign That Changed the Course of the Civil War. And I just want to make sure I get that in there so that our listeners
can
remember that book.
Yes, it's important. But obviously, Eric and I both argue that it's vitally important. No Civil War army is able to advance without a strong logistical network. Even in 1864, late 1864, when we get to Sherman's march to the sea, the classic example of abandoning your logistical network. But he's not abandoning it entirely. He's heading to the sea, where he's going to meet the Union Navy, and they're going to resupply it. And the logistical framework in Tennessee is much different than either the East Coast or the Mississippi River Valley. The rivers don't run the right way. They're shallower. For much of the year, the Cumberland River is not navigable. And even the Tennessee, which flows all the way from the Ohio River up to Chattanooga, isn't navigable through northern Alabama because of Muscle Shoals. You can't take a steamboat and sail all the way to Chattanooga. So suddenly the river becomes an obstacle instead of an avenue of advance. And that means that Rosecrans has to rely on the railroad. And as he's discovered in 1862 and early 1863, the railroad is much more vulnerable to things like cavalry raids and partisan attacks and sabotage. So he has to prepare his ground carefully before he advances. And that's really what Tullahoma is all about. It's to take the Union Army from Middle Tennessee, a bound forward of approximately 100 miles to the banks of the Tennessee River. And then they prepare to cross the Tennessee, and that's the Chickamauga campaign, across the Tennessee and into North Georgia. It's the second phase of really the same long campaign.
And And one of the things that I think is so cool about all this is our readers know you've written this definitive 3-volume history on the Chickamauga campaign, and then and you've got other works about such as Failure in the Saddle, about Forrest Roll there, but then you sort of expanded. You got into Chattanooga kind of as the next step. Then you backtracked and you sort of backfilled with Tullahoma, but it turns out you didn't have enough there. You weren't quite finished saying what you wanted to say with Chattanooga. So this is, I guess, my way of just being a little bit in awe of your ability to spread your wings and really kind of start to tell this very well-grounded, holistic story about everything that's going on in Southeast Tennessee and in Northwest Georgia, or Northwest Georgia.
Well, I thank you, first of all, for the compliment. I do. I'm also a little bit in awe of the fact that I've managed to put out so many books in the past few years. Part of it is just you put your head down and you start writing, and I enjoy the process of writing. It's not usually a struggle, not sometimes, but it's not usually a struggle. And so things flow for me very well. And because I was so immersed in Chickamauga, you can't help but notice you're not telling this story in a vacuum. It's not like one day 2 armies plopped down at the end of August in 1863 out of nowhere. They beamed down from the Starship Enterprise. The framework going back and the framework going forward, the consequences of the defeat at Chickamauga inevitably take you into Chattanooga, because it's all a reaction to what happens at Chickamauga. So.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, so it just, even while I was writing Chickamauga, I was aware that there's still a lot more bits and pieces of this ongoing story to tell. And I was lucky enough, first of all, with the Chattanooga story, to write the emerging Civil War volumes, and also to be asked to do this newest book, Grant at Chattanooga, for Tim Smith and John Marszalek in their Grant in the Civil War series. So
tell me a little bit about that, because you have 2 great books on Chattanooga that were a nice extension of your work from Chickamauga, but they were as the emerging Civil War books are, they're overviews, but you found you had more you wanted to say.
Well, the interplay specifically of Grant and Hooker and George Thomas, Joseph Hooker from the Army of the Potomac fame, Chancellorsville, just all the pieces of that. For instance, Joseph Hooker comes west after the defeat at Chickamauga. He's given command of the force of the Army of the Potomac that's going to rescue General Rosecrans. So he comes west. Who does the federal government give him as his 2 principal subordinates? Oliver Otis Howard, the man Hooker blames for the defeat at Chancellorsville, and Slocum, the 12th Corps commander, who blames Hooker for the defeat at Chancellorsville. These 3, that's the 3 worst choices possible, almost, in the entire Union order of battle. So I found all that fascinating. Yeah. And Lincoln just says, his first telegram to Thomas about this is basically, these 2 guys, or these 3 guys don't get along. Figure it out when they get there. And Grant inherits this mess. But really, I was interested in Ulysses S. Grant. By and large, the historical view of Grant is that Vicksburg made him. He had a shaky start in 1862. He wins at Fort Henry and Donaldson, but then he's surprised at Shiloh, and Shiloh is a victory, but there's a lot of questions. After Shiloh, General Halleck sort of puts him to the one side, and famously Sherman talks about Grant almost resigning, but then comes Vicksburg. He wins Vicksburg. He captures an entire Confederate army. And our popular image is that marks Grant's ascension. His career is made. There's no stopping now. Except that immediately after Vicksburg, the Lincoln government doesn't give Grant any orders, and they basically start breaking up his army to send different pieces of it elsewhere. I think, and I argue in the book, it's not really until the crisis emerges at Chattanooga and Grant comes in and Lincoln picks him for overall command, and Grant succeeds, that now at last Lincoln feels like he has the man who can win the war, and that inevitability begins to march forward. Grant comes east in 1864, and we have the Overland Campaign, and the presidency, you name it, it's Grant all the way. But for those 2 months between Vicksburg, which surrendered on July 4, and the movement at the end of September to rescue Rosecrans, the government doesn't really have a new mission for Grant. They send 10,000 to General Banks in Louisiana, send 10,000 men to Arkansas to General Curtis. Why would you, if you think about it strategically, why would you take your most successful army under your most successful commander, let that army sit there and start parceling out the troops? The government hasn't quite figured this out in terms of a strategic direction yet. I mean, you can sense, first of all, this is a whole other book. Henry Halleck, there's a military vacuum there. Halleck won't make a decision, and you see that increasingly through the war. And Lincoln is still unsure about what happens. But when that crisis hits at Chattanooga, suddenly everybody has a mission, and the government kind of mobilizes all its resources. It's crisis management as opposed to strategic direction.
I've always looked at it. Grant wants to go and get Mobile Bay, and Halleck's like, no, you just stay right there. And Halleck's almost jealous of, I shouldn't say almost, Halleck is jealous of Grant's continued success, and almost strands him in that backwater because he doesn't want him to keep succeeding. And Lincoln's like, oh wait, what happened to Grant? Oh geez, what have you been doing?
Yeah, where was that general that did so well? I've misplaced him. Yeah, there's certainly some interesting dynamics between Grant and Halleck, and I touch on that a little bit in the book, but not too much. Mostly what I'm trying to focus on is Grant coming to Chattanooga, the relief of Rosecrans, which is at the time a fairly big political deal as well. Rosecrans is defeated, but still very popular in the Midwest. Rosecrans is a war Democrat. There are fears within the Lincoln administration that he will run for office in 1864, run as president. He's a son of Ohio and very popular in Ohio. He has, these days we'd call him, or we'd say that he has a strong press, a strong media push behind him. He has very powerful and influential papers in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois supporting him. And so there's some delicacy about relieving it. And it's interesting to me, one of the first things that you encounter in this book is the discussion of Grant and Rosecrans and Edwin Stanton, Stanton wants Rosecrans gone. There's no question about that. But the Lincoln administration doesn't want to appear to have kicked Rosecrans out. They don't want it to be on their hands. It's, like Sir Thomas More, who will rid me of this troublesome priest? Stanton meets Grant and takes a special secret train from Washington in the middle of the night in October, and they meet Grant on a rail platform in Indianapolis, and then Stanton and Grant get on the same car and they rail south to Louisville. And on the way, they have this discussion about which no one really knows. To this day, there's only 4 people or 2 people who really have talked about the Stanton and Grant connection. And then afterwards, Stanton has another secret railway meeting with James Garfield, the outgoing chief of staff of the Army of the Cumberland, and at the time the Union general in command of the U.S. military telegraph, Anson Stager. and they also meet in a railroad car. Stanton is a very secretive guy. He seems to delight in cabals and and plots, frankly. But anyway, Stanton wants to. He wants Rosecrans gone. He doesn't like Rosecrans. They've had a difficult relationship since the beginning of 1863, even earlier, actually. And so he kind of creates the fiction that Grant has his choice. He gives Grant 2 orders on that railroad car. One order places Grant in charge of the entire what we would call the Midwest today, the Military Division of the West, combining the Army of the Cumberland, the Army or the Department of the Cumberland, Department of the Ohio, Department of Mississippi. Places William Sherman in command of the Army of the Tennessee, and Grant is overall direction of the war. That first order leaves Rosecrans in command of the Army of the Cumberland. The second version of that order simply is exactly the same except for one thing. George Thomas takes command and Rosecrans is relieved. Grant says he unhesitatingly chose the second version. He didn't like or trust Rosecrans, and so Rosecrans was gone. And I think it's interesting how Grant words it in his memoirs. He says, "I unhesitatingly chose to relieve General Rosecrans." But I think he's also smart enough that he's sitting in a rail car with arguably one of the most powerful men in Washington, the Secretary of War, who by now is wielding immense influence in the Union war effort. And Stanton makes it very clear that he wants Rosecrans gone. I think Grant simply said, well, there's no point in fighting about this, especially for a guy I don't like. I don't particularly care who commands the Army of the Cumberland. And so he accepted.
Because Grant and Rosecrans had a pretty complicated relationship themselves.
Yes. They had a difficult time in Mississippi over Iuka and Corinth. Rosecrans fought the Battle of Iuka, expecting Grant's support. Grant and his column didn't come up in time. Grant later says that they didn't hear the battle. Rosecrans attacked late. It's a complicated procedure, a complicated effort, a double envelopment, made even more complicated by the fact that if Rosecrans has his media weight behind him, and he does, and those newspapers in Ohio start talking about how Grant screwed it up, Grant also has a fairly savvy media support. He has staff officers who pay attention to these things. You know, Grant was the guy who was smart enough to take Charles A. Dana aside when Dana came as Stanton's spy earlier in the war, and make a friend out of Dana. And then Dana was the Grant, the Grant cheerleader through really the rest of the war. So all of that pulls into this complicated relationship between Grant and Rosecrans. And then so Grant really doesn't have much hesitation in relieving Rosecrans. And that's an interesting part of the story. Then there's the sort of how is Grant going to be received? Equally as fascinating, and I attempt to get into this book, not just how things happened at the time, but also there's a long historiography about all this stuff. There's and amazingly, much of this stuff comes down to very, very slender threads, just an account or two. Another example of that is when Grant, on October 23rd, night of October 24th, actually, I think, rides into the city of Chattanooga. Rosecrans is gone. George Thomas is now in command. And how is Grant received at Thomas's headquarters that evening? Grant reaches Thomas's headquarters. He's already injured from a fall off a horse, so he can't walk. He's wet and muddy because of the rain, and he's seen firsthand the difficulties of Walden's Ridge because he had to come over that ridge. And then the traditional version of that first meeting between Thomas and Grant in Chattanooga is that Thomas was very distant, very almost cold to Grant. And yet there are only 3 really extant accounts that really talk in any length about the meeting between these men. The most commonly accepted one is from James H. Wilson, and it was penned in 1913. And if you know the history of Grant and of Wilson, you know that Wilson, who at the time of, say, Grant's presidency or during the war, is very much a Grant man. By 1900 or so, he's completely down on Grant. He's very unhappy with Grant, and he paints a very difficult situation between Grant and Thomas. But there are 2 other accounts. One is left by Horace Porter of Campaigning with Grant fame. That's the first time Porter meets Grant, because Porter has been a staff officer under Thomas with the Army of the Cumberland. And he paints a much different picture. Thomas is, congenial. Grant has had a meal. He's been offered and refused a change of clothes. And then the third account is unpublished, but it's from Joseph J. Reynolds, who was a divisional commander in the Army of the Cumberland, is now serving as Thomas's chief of staff at that time, and is a classmate of Grant's and a good friend of Grant's. And Thomas says, there's no animosity here. There's no, his account is written, the Chickamauga National Military Park has a copy of it. And his account is written, I think, in the 1880s, well before Wilson's is. And Campaigning with Grant, Horace Porter even comes out before Wilson. So part of the interest in telling that story to me is how Wilson sort of became the dominant version of that story and painted this conflict that nobody else really supports.
And, I think, too, if you don't know the history there, I mean, people do tend to think of Wilson as being one of Grant's guys. Grant's going to take Wilson to the east with him. So, of course, Wilson must be writing the accurate account and not really kind of taking into account that later break that Wilson has. So when Grant shows up there, what do you think the main challenges he has from a leadership point of view that he's got to take care of?
Well, first and foremost, he has to restore an effective line of communications to Bridgeport. He has to be able to get rations and forage, especially forage for the horses, into Chattanooga, because without that, the Army will either have to retreat or God forbid, surrender. They probably wouldn't surrender. They would attempt to retreat over the mountains, but they'd have to abandon all their artillery. They're already desperately short of horses. The Army would effectively disintegrate within a month by mid-November if something isn't done. Fortunately, Grant discovers that there's already a plan that's been emerging. Rosecrans has already put a plan together. It's about ready to be executed. Grant, in his memoir, says, I don't really understand why it was an excellent plan. The only thing I could wonder about is why he didn't already begin it. Well, the reason he didn't initiate operations is because it hinged on a number of different pieces. They had to build pontoon boats in Chattanooga. They didn't have enough pontoons with them, so they had to build boats. Those had to be ready. Hooker's reinforcements from Virginia were still coming up, and they were delayed by a Confederate cavalry raid. So it's not really until the end of October that all the moving pieces of this operation are put together. And then it's the Union troops under Hooker march out from Bridgeport, and the Army of the Cumberland in Chattanooga seizes places around Browns Ferry and Wauhatchie at the foot of Lookout Mountain. They have to do it all at once as a surprise, because if one piece comes out and the other doesn't, then the Confederates have an opportunity to just turn around and crush one piece or the other. So it has to be a coordinated effort, and that's much harder to pull off effectively. But within a week, Grant's there on the 24th. By October 27th, 28th, it has succeeded. It begins almost immediately. And that greatly eases Grant's problems, because now the Army will not have to make a critical decision within the next month. They still have many problems, and most especially for the Army of the Cumberland. They're losing like 1,000 horses a day due to starvation and malnutrition, and they can't move their artillery, they can't move their supply wagons, they can't do anything. But that over time can be corrected, especially since there are reinforcements coming not only from Virginia under Hooker, but also Grant has already called forward General Sherman with 20,000 veterans from the Army of the Tennessee. And those are the people Grant really wants, because that's the army he trusts. Those are the men that he has unlimited faith in. Maybe like Lee at Gettysburg. He's just confident of those guys. They're going to do the job. And then there's one other piece of thinking that is constantly on his mind, and it's primarily brought to the forefront by Abraham Lincoln. And that's at the time of Chickamauga, another Union force under Ambrose Burnside of about 25,000 men moved into East Tennessee and occupied Knoxville in the upper Tennessee Valley there. And with Chattanooga surrounded and besieged, Burnside is also essentially besieged. He has one tenuous supply line, an overland supply line up into Kentucky. But even with a much smaller army, that's very difficult to manage. Just keep hauling wagons once again through the rain and through the wilderness. It's a bad time of year to be, hanging by that wagon thread. And Lincoln, of course, has been concerned about East Tennessee since 1861. There's a line in the book that Sherman writes to Grant that is just one of my favorite lines. Sherman is the man if you want to go for just that perfect quote that, he has no filter. He just says what he thinks. And in this one letter to Grant, he says, "Recollect, East Tennessee is my horror." Because he was the guy in 1861 that Grant was pounding on, Lincoln was pounding on. You got to get into East Tennessee. And Sherman's, when he was in command in Louisville in 1861, he's the guy who said, it's going to take 300,000 men. We don't have that kind of force. And everybody said, you're crazy. That's not going to. And so that was Sherman's horror. He thought the Union had no business in East Tennessee. It was a quagmire in a blind alley, but there are 25,000 federal troops there, and Lincoln wants East Tennessee, and so by extension, Grant wants East Tennessee. And all through the correspondence, if you go through the OR volumes, all through this period from October, November, and into early December, even after Chattanooga is a successful Union victory. On every page, on almost every telegram from Grant, there's something about East Tennessee. It's a vital interest to Lincoln, so it's a vital interest to Grant. And so that's so his operations are not just aimed at lifting the siege of Chattanooga, but also opening up access to East Tennessee. So it's a two-part problem.
Now,
and then
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, in one final piece, Grant doesn't have a lot of faith in the Army of the Cumberland. When he gets there, he thinks they're demoralized. As a matter of fact, in the first week in November, on November 7th, when the Federals discover that James Longstreet has been sent into East Tennessee to move against Ambrose Burnside, Grant kind of has a panic moment. He doesn't want 20,000 more Confederates rushing up there. He doesn't know the exact number, and they exaggerate it, but they see it as 20,000 men headed to Knoxville, and Grant's like, well, we've got to do something. So he unilaterally orders Thomas to attack Missionary Ridge on November 7, 1863. And none of the reinforcements are there yet. All of this artillery, all of these horses are a major problem. And Thomas is like, we can't attack. We're in no condition to launch any sort of attack. Thomas is correct. The Army is not in any condition to launch an attack. But Grant sort of overlooks that, and he feels that the Army of the Cumberland can't be relied on. He thinks if Sherman gets there with the Army of the Tennessee and sets the example and they launch that attack, then the Army of the Cumberland will catch whatever infectious morale there is and follow suit. But on their own, Grant has no faith in the Army of the Cumberland.
And it's so funny when you articulate it that way, and the dominoes fall in almost the entire opposite direction, where it's, Sherman's not the one who's able to get any traction, but Thomas does, Hooker does, all the people that Grant's not really counting on actually come through.
Exactly. The battle is, again, we go to the historiography and the sort of the battle is sold as the perfect Grant plan. Sherman is the guy who really pushes this idea, but also Adam Badeau in his immediate post-war history of Grant, and some other early military histories of Grant in that appear in the 1860s. They end up they're preliminary to Grant's political run in 1868, and so, but they all portray the battle, the campaign of Chattanooga, really, because it's a multiple series of actions. They all portray it as the most perfectly planned campaign of the war. Grant's going to move this chess piece here and this chess piece here, and suddenly Braxton Bragg, the Confederate commander, is going to be completely flummoxed, and he's just done. Well, as you pointed out, none of that actually works. The army that's supposed to carry the way and carry the ball, the Army of the Tennessee under William Sherman, they fumble. They stumble on November 25th. They're assigned to attack the northern portion of Missionary Ridge, the least defended portion of it. They actually are ordered to cross the river and seize it on November 24. And Sherman gets across the river on the 24th, and then they kind of inch forward, and he takes a hill that he thinks is on Missionary Ridge. It's not. Today we know it as Billy Goat Hill. At the time, it was either known as Goat Hill or possibly Billy Goat Hill. If you go to the east, you go to Fredericksburg, and we have voluminous history of the city since the 1700s. Chattanooga has none of that. It's a frontier town. There's only 2,500 people in it in 1860, and we have trouble pinning down who was living where, identifying houses on Missionary Ridge at the time of the battle. It's really interesting when you start to dig into this to see how much of a blank slate we really have about what's going on in Chattanooga in terms of the civilian and the pre-war life and all that. Sherman doesn't secure any local guides, and so he thinks he's on Missionary Ridge, but he's not. He's on this separate hill, but he tells Grant, I have seized Missionary Ridge all the way to the famous railroad tunnel, which will become a major point of contention the next day. And Grant reports that to Washington. And they, frankly, on November 25th, the day of the actual Battle of Missionary Ridge, the Federals sort of get up and look around, and they're not sure if the Confederates are going to stay there, because if Sherman is indeed on Missionary Ridge as far as Tunnel Hill, Bragg's flank is compromised because his main supply depot is a place called Chickamauga Station on Chickamauga Creek, about 2.5 miles behind Missionary Ridge at the northern end. So if Sherman's on the ridge, Bragg has to shift his supply depot south, and they might be gone. Well, it turns out they're not gone because Sherman's not on the ridge, and overnight Bragg has reinforced. And so Sherman will spend November 25th trying to launch some attacks to get to capture what he said he's already captured. It doesn't work. Missionary Ridge is extremely difficult terrain if it's defended properly, and In 1863, it was defended properly, primarily by Patrick Cleburne, but Cleburne is supported by his corps commander, William Hardy, who reinforces him as needed. And that part of the battle is actually, you'd argue, a Confederate victory. The problem comes that Grant, in almost well, certainly in a concern, I don't want to say a panic, but he's very nervous. He's watching Sherman not make any headway, and things aren't going well. And so finally, he orders the Army of the Cumberland to just advance, make a demonstration against the foot of Missionary Ridge, where the original Confederate earthworks were. And as we know, that turns into an advance. They seize the initial works pretty easily. And then suddenly, 25,000 men of the Army of the Cumberland are streaming up Missionary Ridge. They're ascending this brutally steep ridge, almost climbing hand over hand in some cases. And they sweep the top of the ridge. They, you know, the one of the first penetrations is the 24th Wisconsin, with Arthur MacArthur carrying the flag up the hill. They come out right at Bragg's headquarters at the top of the ridge. And then, as if to further compound matters, Joseph Hooker has captured Lookout Mountain on November 24th. He doesn't have a mission. Grant didn't actually want to attack Lookout Mountain because Lookout Mountain was full of Confederate troops, and Grant thought, well, it's better to have that 2 Confederate divisions over there on Lookout Mountain than it is to have them all back on Missionary Ridge. Grant's thinking there was actually not bad, but Thomas wants Lookout Mountain because once it's firmly back in Union control, at last the Federals can rebuild the rail line into Chattanooga. So Grant's thinking tactically, Thomas is thinking logistically. Grant was probably correct, because if they defeated the Bragg's Confederates on Missionary Ridge, there's no way any Confederate is staying on Lookout Mountain. But that's neither here nor there. Hooker has attacked and captured the mountain, and then on November 25th, he moves against the southern end of Missionary Ridge, and he captures goes through a gap at Rossville, and then he turns north, and it's actually his 3 divisions from 3 separate armies, a real polyglot force. They turn north along Missionary Ridge, and they're the primary reason why so many Confederates are captured, because they come up behind a good portion of Bragg's army. And by nightfall on November 25th, suddenly Grant has this spectacular victory in hand. They've charged up the ridge. The Confederates are routed. They've captured 60 cannon. The only part of the ridge that's not captured is the part that Sherman was supposed to capture. That's the part that's still in Confederate hands, and Hardee and Cleburne make an effective withdrawal overnight and actually form the rear guard of the army.
Basically save the Confederate army there.
Yes.
So with all this going on, fascinating stuff. Why does Chattanooga get so overlooked?
Well, it's not as overlooked as some topics. There have been a couple of pretty good books on it over the years.
Says the guy who wrote about Tullahoma and knows about overlooked topics.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Compare it to Tullahoma.
But typically Chattanooga, as you've said, is not ranked as one of Grant's marquee victories the way Vicksburg is, or some of his work in the Overland Campaign.
Yeah, it's interesting because early on, it was, as I just mentioned, it was Grant's set piece strategic masterpiece. And then over time, that sort of faded. And I'm not sure I can tell you why that faded. Grant himself, his memoirs talk about it, certainly, but I don't think he wanted to dwell on it too much. Sherman certainly didn't. Sherman had some bad days in Chattanooga, where he was just not tactically competent, and so he made a fairly strong effort to he's one of the prime drivers behind the whole strategic masterpiece idea, because then he changes the entire narrative and says, well, I was never meant to capture the ridge. I was just a diversion that made it easy for George Thomas. so they kind of bend the narrative there as best they can. And that becomes, certainly by the 1880s, 1890s, that becomes the sort of standard narrative, which drives the Army of the Cumberland veterans nuts because they know the truth.
Sure.
And they have, they dispute Sherman's version quite a bit, shall we say, in things like National Tribune and in their own memoirs.
And I always thought it was fascinating. Before Grant writes his own memoirs and he's writing these articles for Century Magazine, he's supposed to write about Appomattox, and he swaps that out for Chattanooga. Like, he thought Chattanooga was worth writing about more than Appomattox, which fascinates me. So, that kind of shows how much emphasis or importance it had in his mind.
And I think the final reason why Chattanooga gets less attention going forward, say certainly into the Lost Cause era, is because the Confederates don't want to talk about it. Right. They want to talk about Robert E. Lee. Yes, but have you seen what General Lee's doing? And so the Army of Tennessee, the Confederate Army of Tennessee, also becomes a sort of forgotten episode. Right. And it's not really until the Centennial period, or even the post-Centennial period, the 1870s, that you start to see a lot more attention being devoted again to the West. When I first started reading about the Civil War, when I caught the first bit of high school or first bit of Civil War bug in high school, I read about the Eastern Theater because, Shelby Foote's 3 volumes were lauded as such a great thing because he devoted half the space to the East and half to the West. Bruce Catton does spend a fair amount of time in the Western Theater, but really, if you've read Bruce Catton's work, you know where his heart is. It's with the Army of the Potomac, and it's with the Eastern Theater. And those are such influential books that I think, when you get into the sort of the modern era, it's not until, I couldn't put a date on it exactly, but certainly 1980s, 1990s, you start to see a real move back into the Western Theater.
So tell me about the title of your book here, Impulse of Victory, because we've talked about what a hot mess Chattanooga was in some ways, and all these competing leadership issues that he has to deal with, and yet somehow Grant still manages to win. And I think that ties into this, what I think is a fantastic title.
Well, I think the Impulse of Victory refers kind of to 2 things. First of all, it refers to Grant. I like the fact that Grant doesn't give up. I'm a big admirer of George Thomas, but if Thomas encounters a setback militarily, he stops, he thinks about the setback, and they figure out what to do next. But Grant, standing there on Orchard Knob, watching the battle develop, not in the way that he thought, he doesn't call a halt. He doesn't say, okay, we're not winning this. He starts to look at other things. And many people debate, and history is full of debate about whether the Army of the Cumberland was supposed to just take the rifle pits or go all the way up to the top, or there's a whole chapter that discusses that in the book. But the bottom line is that Grant saw that's not going well over there, so now I'm going to have to do something over here. And it's that, the mark of great generalship is not the man who has the best plan, because as General Moltke has told us, no plan survives contact. The mark of great generalship is what happens when your plan falls apart, how you react, and how you execute after things have fallen apart. And yes, Grant got lucky at Chattanooga, but he also didn't give up. And that's a defining characteristic of Grant. Whatever campaign you talk about, Grant doesn't give up. Right. Whether he's sitting there at that rainy night in Shiloh, Sherman's like, we really got our butts kicked. Yeah, lick them tomorrow though. Or Vicksburg. How many times you read about the Vicksburg campaign? Grant tries this, Grant tries that. That didn't work. That didn't work. Well, we'll figure out a new approach. He doesn't give up, and that's very important in any military sphere. That's critical. And then the other part of it is it refers to a line talking about the men of the Army of the Cumberland were carried forward up that ridge, basically carried on the impulse of victory. And I have a great deal of respect for the Army of the Cumberland. They wanted a lot of their own back. They wanted revenge, and that opportunity came on November 25th. So I see both of those things complementing each other: Grant's will and the Army of the Cumberland's determination. And even though the Army of the Cumberland and Grant never really gel, when you go to an Army of the Cumberland reunion, you don't see a whole lot of pro-Grant speeches, but they complement each other very well, and that is really what produced the victory.
We're talking with Dave Powell about his new book, Impulse of Victory, Grant at Chattanooga. Dave, I wish you all the best with this book and with your Tullahoma book. It's so great to have these additions to this expanding story, the epicenter of Dave Powell's work.
Well, thank you.
So, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Chris Mackowski. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.